In this episode of the Project Management Podcast, we talk about the Agile Practice Guide that was released earlier this year. Hello and welcome to the Project Management Podcast at em-podcast.com. I'm Cornelius Fichtner. We are coming to you live from the splendid 2017 PMI Global Conference in Chicago. And sitting with me here at the PMI bookstore are Jesse Fuel and Mike Griffith. Hello, Mike.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
And Jesse.
Hey, good to be here.
And listeners of the podcast already have noticed this sounds a bit different than normal interviews do. Yes, we're using the handheld mic today because there are three of us. And since I started out with Mike, let's continue with Mike. Mike, question for you. The people, listeners there, have been introduced to PMI before. However, the Agile Alliance was part of the development of the Agile Practice Guide. Who is the Agile Alliance?
Sure. So the Agile Alliance is a not-for-profit group that exists to promote and educate people about Agile methods. So Agile is a broad umbrella of methods. People are very familiar with Scrum, but it includes other approaches such as XP and feature-driven development and others out there. And the Agile Alliance is, like I say, this not-for-profit group that creates their own conferences and promotes Agile and Agile practices in organizations. So they're a resource center. You can go there to learn more about Agile and techniques.
What was the vision for developing the Agile Practice Guide?
So it was really to provide guidance for project practitioners that are frequently in the space of having Agile teams or being asked to spin up Agile teams, quite often in less than Agile environments. So we describe the hybrid environment being where we have some Agile elements in play, but parts of the organization are still, traditionally predictive or plan-driven. And so the Agile Practice Guide was really the basic steps for project practitioners who are in that space, who would like to become more agile and perhaps not sure how to do that or what steps to follow. And we wanted to provide a methodology agnostic, independent way of providing that guidance.
And Jesse, even though it's methodology agnostic, what methodology or framework did you actually follow as you prepared and developed the guide? Was it more a plan-driven or was it more an agile approach?
Well, Mike would say it was a hybrid approach. We had a very firm, fixed deadline with respect to publication. I mean, this is a publication project, and so there's a fixed deadline that had to synchronize with the publication of PMBOK 6th edition because we needed to align with that from a content perspective and from a product delivery perspective. But within those firm, fixed kind of constraints before which a lot of things happened and after which a lot of things happened, we were very organic and very fluid and very iterative in the creation of the draft, the manuscript itself. So we started first maybe with weekly iterations, and then that kind of evolved later down the road to more ad hoc iterations once we were getting crunch time. So we didn't actually follow any formal methodology per se, as much as we were trying to be as flexible and adaptive and iterative within a fixed schedule.
Who is the intended audience of the guide?
It's really for project managers who are starting on their Agile journey. There's just so much to this conversation. One of the explicit things that Mike was mentioning is we had to choose an audience. We had to choose a firm what is in scope and what is out of scope definition. And so we really wanted to center it towards project managers who are kind of beginning in their guide. So for those of you who are listening that are a little bit more experienced with Agile methods, you'll find the guide to be filled with very familiar content, and so that's who we targeted.
Let's talk about your roles on the guide as you were developing it. Mike, what was your role?
So I was representing the PMI. I was chairperson for the core writing team. As Jesse said, it was very organic. So I don't really think my role was very different from everybody else in that I was part of the team that did the pair writing and the pair reviewing of chapters. I had a little bit more coordination, I guess, to do. So I helped with the kickoff. I prepared, some slides around what we hope to achieve, what some of our inputs and some of our constraints are likely to be. And it was really down to me when we were missing deadlines or up against the gun in terms of having to deliver. Our sponsors of PMI and the Agile Alliance would approach me and say, hey, Mike, where are you at? When are you guys going to be done? We need to see a new draft, whatever. So my role was fairly light from that coordination perspective because I basically just pushed everything to the team and said, hey, here's where we're at. They're looking for a new draft. What can we cut, by the date?
And Jesse, where were you involved?
Well, I was one of the other I think it was a total of 7 core team members. And my experience was very similar to Mike's. Mike's had a lot of that public-facing responsibilities, some of the more administrative things. But all of us worked in pairs, and each pair was responsible for a chapter. And then after we finished a chapter, we would rotate, where there would be another pair that would review it and then offer feedback, and then we would synthesize those different parts of it. We also had a couple of face-to-face meetings in person, and that's where everybody had a responsibility to contribute as a group. And then it was fortunate that at our last face-to-face, we had the full team together where we could actually finalize everyone's opinion. So each person had to write a certain chapter, but it was done as a pair. And so each pair would self-organize, who would get what part and who would get another part, and then another pair would review it afterwards. So that's what kind of like a day in the life of Agile Practice Guide team member would look like.
How long did it take from start to finish in the project when you first got on board to, okay, it is now September 6th and it's out?
So we started, I think, in August of 2016 with our kickoff meeting. And we basically only had from then until the end of the year to do our writing. So we had from August through to December to get the first draft written. And then it went out for peer review. So we had 30 Agile practitioners and 30 PMI, sort of more traditional project managers, review it and provide feedback. We expected to get about 1,000 comments on it. That's typical for a guide of this length. We got over 3,000 comments back, so we really scrambled to try and sort our way through all of those comments. So the writing period was compressed into a few months. We then had this period of review, because that takes a while, and then figuring out what to do with the comments, because it's a PMI standard, each comment has to be reviewed by at least 2 people, and then we got to either accept it, defer it, or reject it, or accept with modification. So we had this to do for over 3,000 of these items that came back. So a good chunk of our time in the new year before it went for final publication, which I think was around April or May time, was working our way through those comments. How many of these things can we incorporate? How many of these things should we defer till iteration 2? And how many of these, are just plain perhaps wrong? And so we should politely say thank you for your comment, but we won't be undertaking this at this time.
Personal interest last year at the conference in San Diego, I believe we were. You had a workshop where people could come in and also provide input. Yeah. How was that input used in order to develop the guide?
Yes, so we did run that workshop, and which was very valuable. 2 things came out of it. It validated the outline that we'd already developed for the document, and it also gave us a couple of areas to focus on. So people were interested in hybrid. That came up a number of times at that workshop, and so we highlighted that. And they also wanted some tools to help them figure out when to maybe consider agile versus hybrid versus a predictive. And so that led to the development of an appendix that we created. So the inputs that were realized or created, I guess, at that workshop did have a direct impact on the content that we developed.
Can I follow up on that? And that was one of what I would say were 4 stakeholder user review opportunities. There was the expert review that you mentioned. There was also the membership advisory groups that contributed to some feedback and some input. And then there was also the blog posts that we did. We were doing incremental releases of draft material on projectmanagement.com and agilealliance.org's blog sites. And so there were multiple channels of community input into the guide, both during the writing of it and during the revision of it.
There are a number of different methodologies and frameworks out there in the Agile world, Scrum, DSTM, SAFe, Crystal, to name just a few. Where does the Agile Practice Guide fall in this overall spectrum?
So in the guide, there is an appendix that lists some of the most popular and relevant frameworks that are in use in the industry. But with respect to the guide itself, the core body of it was more about individual practices, because at the end of the day, any given methodology is just a curated collection of certain practices. Another methodology has a lot of overlap because we share the same practices. And so we focused on those sets of practices that would be most appropriate for projects of a small to medium size, not large programs, and not the entire organization. Also, we wanted to make sure that the frameworks that we used were industry agnostic, or the techniques that we talked could be really industry agnostic. There's a push by both PMI and the Agile Alliance to take these kind of techniques across the world and across industries. So we didn't. The guide kind of does a little bit of an honorary nod to some of those frameworks in an appendix at the end, but the core body of it is more about the actual techniques that people use.
Is it prescriptive?
No. In fact, the language is very familiar to a lot of PMI members who read standards that say, in this situation, you may consider doing this, or in this situation, you should probably try this technique. And the idea is to exert intentional and thoughtful effort to choosing techniques fit for use and fit for purpose. There is no one size fits all, and the formalized, productized, and branded frameworks that are out there are good places to start. But the guide was intentional in trying to synthesize all of that into some guidelines, regardless of which methodology you would use, or regardless of where you might be starting. Here's something to try. Just try it out. So not prescriptive, and industry agnostic, methodology agnostic, and it's also, in my opinion, it's the first major Agile publication that is non-commercial, community authored, and methodology agnostic. And that's really important because those criteria allowed it to be a collaboration with the Agile Alliance and PMI, who share those values.
The practice guide has 5 major sections, and if you don't mind, I'd like to go through the 5 and just talk about it and see, what do we learn in each of those. Who wants to take the first one? Introduction to Agile.
So the Introduction to Agile chapter really is just to orient the reader in what Jesse was just talking about, that this is a methodology agnostic description of some practices for you to consider. So we talk about the Agile umbrella encompassing many different approaches such as Scrum, but also XP, feature-driven development, Crystal, DSTM, and some of the collection frameworks too, including SAFe, Disciplined Agile, LESS, and Nexus. So we provide a context, if you like, and then we clearly state that some of our definitions. So when we're saying what is Agile, we're saying Agile is when you apply the Agile mindset along with the Agile values and principles towards your work. If you mix 2 Agile approaches such as XP and Scrum that are both Agile in their own right, we end up with a blended approach which is also Agile because you're mixing 2 Agile elements. But when you mix Agile with something that's not Agile, you can't really call the result Agile either because you've now got a hybrid, you've got a mixing of that. So this chapter 1 sort of really just outlines Agile is a large collection of different approaches. When you mix 2 of them together, you end up with a blended approach, which is still Agile. When you mix Agile and non-Agile approaches together, you end up with something that we're not calling Agile for the guide. And I think that's the purpose of that first chapter.
Then we have a life cycle selection. What's that all about, Jesse?
Well, the life cycle describes what happens when. And in the PMBOK 5th edition, there was the release of a linear a continuum of life cycles where on one extreme you would have plan-driven and predictive approaches, and on the other extreme you would have adaptive and agile approaches with some iterative incremental thing in between. And what was fun to discover and to formalize was a two-dimensional continuum where there's the degree of change you might have versus the degree the frequency of delivery you might have. And the more you have of each, the closer you're being to more agile in your environment and your approach. And then the less frequently you deliver and the less change you have, you may not need the overhead of agile methods. You could use a plan-driven predictive approach and achieve the same results as you're going for. And so the chapter talks a lot about differentiating between what is it when we say an iterative life cycle versus an incremental life cycle, and versus plan-driven and agile, and with that 2x2 or that two-dimensional framework, it helps drive the conversation. And what it then goes into a conversation about the hybrid is in section 3, and so that's where we start talking about. You may not find that you're exactly and completely only in the incremental area, or you're exactly only completely in the iterative area. You might find that you're not blending, you're combining, integrating different parts of it into a hybrid approach.
Next, we have implementing Agile, creating an agile environment.
Yes, this module talks about the transformational role for a project manager. So rather than being the hub of tasks and control and information, we're switching more to a servant leadership model where the leader empowers the team and gives them responsibility and helps clear the path for them to be successful. So we're looking at the use of servant leadership by managers, and then some of the team composition elements that are really suitable. So we talk about the agile roles and the idea of a generalized specialist. So instead of having deep vertical specializations, if we can have still those same skills, but with some other talents. So maybe you've got a developer if you're in a software instance, or you've got a marketer or a reviewer if you're in a publishing situation that can do their role very well, but they can also do some of the sort of pre their role activities and some of the post their role activities too. So when we get these generalizing specialists or T-shaped people that are not only deep in their own role but also have some transition, it really helps us with swarming on a team and getting tasks through to completion. So we talk about different team member roles, and we also talk here in this section about workspaces. So if we can get people co-located, then we need to rely less upon written sort of documentation, and we can leverage some more of the tacit knowledge and unwritten knowledge that face-to-face communication supports.
So that was implementing Agile, creating an Agile environment. The next one sounds very close to it. It's implementing Agile, delivering in an Agile environment. Jesse, you don't want to take that?
Sure. This is different in emphasis, where the previous section was about creating an environment. This is about getting the work done. So this section offers some specific techniques that you can use: retrospectives, backlogs, daily stand-ups, iteration-based planning, some like real technical meat into it. A lot of people who want to go straight to agile processes might go straight to this section around delivering in an agile fashion. But when you do that, you skip all the foundational concepts that we've been building up to it. And that's one of the key points of the guide, is that what you do is based on what you believe. And so we spend a lot of time introducing in the guide those philosophical values and principles, and then that's reflected in the environment that we work in, and then we can talk about the process and techniques we use.
Since the PMBOK guide and the Agile Practice guide were released on the same day, PMI decided that the PMP exam and the PMI-ACP exam are also going to be changing on the same day, March 26, 2018. What sort of influence does the Agile Practice Guide have in regards to the coming changes?
Yeah, that's a great question that's caused a lot of confusion recently. And so I checked with the PMI, and of course they were engaged throughout this process, and we had the conversation a few times. And what's happening in March of 2018 is a lexicon update to align the terminology used in both the ACP exam and also the PMP prep exam towards a standardized lexicon. So in other words, the exam content outline for the ACP exam is not changing. You'll still be tested only on the same topics. However, the way that those topics are described and used is being updated to be consistent with the Agile Practice Guide. Now, we made a few lexicon updates. We changed the definitions for a couple of minor terms, and they are incredibly minor. So I would not want to worry people. We didn't change sprints to purely iterations or anything like that. They were very minor changes, yet the PMI has a duty to keep everything in sync and up to date. And that's all that they're doing in March. So don't get freaked out by all this new content you have to learn. The exam is defined by the exam content outline, which won't be changing in March 2018.
Last but not least, we have organizational considerations for project agility.
This was, first of all, notice the title. The title is not organizational agility. The title is Organizational Considerations for Project Agility, and that's a mouthful, but at the end of the day, what we wanted to talk about here was not about creating an agile company. Like, oh, we're going to go agile. We're agile now. Well, okay, maybe that's a good thing to do, but let's do that after we first start talking about how to make our projects successful and what do we need to change in the organization around that. And so the first thing that we talk about is organizational change management. So there are a lot of project managers out there who are stuck having to deliver things without understanding the people side of change and the people side of projects. And then we talk about culture. What is it? How do we look at it? How do we understand it around? And then we talk about this scaling conversation, which is around agile program management. So we intentionally decided we were not going to cover a detailed treatise on agile program management or agile portfolio management, but we at least wanted to define some terms for contrast purposes. And then we wrap up this section around the PMO, because the role of a PMO in an agile environment absolutely shifts from being an enforcement agency to being an enablement agency. And so all of these add up to creating an organization that supports project agility, which is the first step in creating an agile organization. So the guide stops short of that bigger secondary goal.
How would our listeners use the Agile Practice Guide on one of their projects?
Well, I think it'd be great if they read through it first. They look for any pain points that they identify with, they're already experiencing, and then look at the recommendations. So we have a few sections where we have a table of, it's almost like a medical pattern where you have, if you have this symptom, then consider these possible treatments. And it's not always a one-to-one. If you're having problems around stakeholder engagement, it will provide you with a couple of alternatives, ideas to consider. And so I think that was one way for people to use the guide, read it through, see if there's anything they identify with, see if there's any of the pain points that they're currently experiencing, and then also look for gaps. So if there are things in there that you aren't using, but it's an area where you feel like you need some support, then absolutely, consider the approaches recommended. Also, you can use it as a little bit of a bridge. If you're struggling to identify or converse with some people who are perhaps more on the predictive end of the spectrum, you could use some of the tools and assessments to figure out, where do you feel we are in terms of suitability? So we have a suitability filter in one of the appendices, and I think that's a good tool for leveling expectations amongst multiple stakeholders. You could sit down and review it and see if there's agreement in terms of our suitability for an agile or a hybrid approach.
The PMBOK Guide, 6th edition, and the Agile Practice Guide, they were both released on the same day. How much input did you have for the considerations for agile environments that are now in most knowledge areas of the PMBOK Guide? So,
funny you should ask, because Mike and I drafted those together. And we did that as part of a knowledge continuation between the PMBOK core project team as well as the Agile Practice Guide team. That we wanted to make sure that there was connectivity between what the Agile content that was put in the PMBOK proper versus the content that was put in the supplemental guide. And the reason, and I had actually one colleague of mine say, Jesse, that just feels like the Agile was bolted onto the PMBOK. It doesn't feel real. And I told him, I said, actually, it was PMI responding to market demand, because during the PMBOK project, the PMBOK 6 project, there was some, the market was saying, we would like some Agile content here. And so Mike and I were in conversations about this practice guide, and then PMI said, you know what, while you're at that, how about you put together some content for us, and oh, by the way, you have 2 weeks. And you know, we pulled it off, but we also had a lot of support from the PMBOK team, and we were able to take that as the seeds or the inspirations leading into the Agile Practice Guide itself.
The 2 guides were published in one PDF document. Does this point to a future when there is only one document? Literally, where, you know, either the PMBOK guide merges into the Agile Practice Guide or the other way around?
No, I don't think so. It was great for us to get the level of exposure that we did by having them linked together like that. You know, Jesse and I worked on the software extension to the PMBOK guide, and we got nowhere near the exposure. So that standard's been around for several years now, and it's had, you know, a relatively small number of downloads. So it was great for us that the 2 were linked together, and they're being promoted together at this conference. But I don't think it's an indicator that they will become one document in the future.
What's next? The first version is out. 2018 is coming, very quickly. Are you already working on the next version?
Well, one thing that the practice guide uniquely closes with a call to action. This is the first iteration. I like to say it's actually 1.2, because we incorporated community feedback, and then we went through a refinement, kind of a hardening at the end. But it's not finished, and we intentionally descoped a lot of content. So there's a huge opportunity for the community to come back and say, "What about this? And what about that? And you need to refine this content. It's just not really polished." And we're going to be waiting for that input to come in. We're also advocating for a new version of the Agile Practice Guide sooner than the standard 5-year cycle. There's a lot of things that need to fall into place for that to happen. But for right now, what's going to happen next is the ACP credential is going to be updated with some of that content in 2018. And then we're just going to see. We're going to see how the community responds. Does the community want to have a kind of another Agile specialty document, or is there time to look at some other things? So that's kind of where things are. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. We really just want to make sure that people know that this material is there and that they can start experimenting with it and then respond to whatever comes out of it.
Now that you have been exposed to so many more readers through the combined publication of these 2 guides in one document, what are your recommendations to those listeners out there, in closing here, who have not yet emerged or started out on the journey to Agile?
I'd recommend to them, here's another tool that can assist you in that journey. One of the unique things about it is most Agile texts make the assumption that you are transforming or moving towards a purely Agile destination. It's about how do we become Agile, how do you get to Agile, whereas this practice guide makes it clear that it's okay if you don't get all the way there, that maybe your organization or your project type actually suits a partial Agile implementation best. And so this hybrid element is a legitimate starting point, and it's also sometimes a legitimate destination. And I think that's useful, and hopefully helpful for our readers.
The other recommendation or tip would be this guide was written expressly for you, the Agile beginner, from the project manager who wants to start getting an understanding of what this is, without having to filter out a lot of the dogma, without having to filter out which of the formal branded Agile methodologies or certifications do I need to worry about. You know what? Don't worry about that. Just take a look at the guide and try something. Just try one of these techniques. Try the filters and the suitability factors and the tailoring. And that's going to be the best first way to get started with your Agile journey.
Excellent. Jesse, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Mike, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.